Good morning, afternoon, or evening to signing on, depending on where it is in the world you're calling from. It is 6 p.m. here in New York. We're going to wait another minute or so and let people sign in, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody, to part three of our law school application summer boot camp. I'm so glad that you could join us. My name is Alex Jablonski. I am the Assistant Director for Pre-Law and Pregraduate Advising here at Cornell. And this is part three, Creating Competitive Law School Application Materials. This is probably, as you can imagine, part three of a four-part series that we've been running this summer, covering the full sweep of the law school application process. Back in June, we started with an overview. Last session, we talked about building your school list. This session, we're going to be diving deep on the various components of the application. And then next time, we're going to be kind of looking through the cycle itself, post-application for the most part, talking about review, talking about wait lists, talking about financing, and rounding out our discussion. As we've been going each session, we've also been moving in stages through the process of creating your materials, particularly writing your essays, starting with brainstorming and outlining. And today we're going to continue that conversation with drafting and then revising, we'll talk about next time. If you have signed in at all, I will send you these slides as well as the exercise handout that we're going to review at the end of today. Our goal is to get all of this posted on the Cornell website for those of you who weren't able to attend previous sessions. My apologies, it's taking us a little bit longer to get those uploaded than we had hoped, but hopefully in the next week or two we will have them. If you didn't attend a previous session and would like those materials, please just email me. I'm more than happy to send you everything that we've covered so far. Today's agenda, we are going to start with an overview, as we've done each session, of the pre-law advising services that you have available to you through Cornell. And then we're going to dive into the topic. So we're going to look at what our goals are for our materials, what it is that law schools are looking for, and so what targets we should be hitting. And then we'll go in turn through each of the major material categories, the form, your academic record, your test scores, letters of recommendation, resume, and we'll end with essays, which will let us transition into the conversation about drafting. I am part of, and my colleague Dana, who you see on the webinar as well, and who's going to be managing the questions in the chat as we go along, are pre-law advisors in the Cornell Career Services Central Office, which is in Barnes Hall, if you are familiar with or remember campus, right across from Willard Straight. We serve all students and alumni at any stage of the pre-law process, and then you also have pre-law advisors in most of the major colleges. So if you're a student or an alum of any of these colleges, you have an additional pre-law advisor available to you. One of the main pitches, one of the main purposes of running this series is to get you connected with us and to encourage you in particular to come in, work on these materials, get your questions answered over the summer, because the fall, once applications open and the fall semester starts, we get much, much busier with student appointments. Not that we're unavailable, but we have more availability over the summer, and it's a great time to get started on this process by attending this webinar. You're already getting started on it, and we would love to continue that process with you. As we go forward, if you have questions at all, please do feel free to put them in the Q&A section. Dana will answer some in chat, some we'll do live, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end where Dana will join me and we'll field questions back and forth to round out our evening tonight. Pre-law advisors at Cornell can help you in two broad ways. First, to explore, to decide whether or not law might be the option for you, everything from initially learning what the field involves to developing a plan for exploring your interests, to making connections, to considering what a legal career might look like for you. This part we're really keen on. We'd like to work with people early in the process as much as we do in the application process. And we are more than happy to talk with people who decide to maybe not go to law school in the future. That's as much a success from our perspective as people who decide that they do want to go and ultimately apply to law school. We are happy to support you wherever it is you are on that journey. In addition to exploration, of course, this is the main topic for this summer. We are your main supports, hopefully one of your main supports as you pursue the application process. We can work with you on overall strategy and timeline, researching schools, developing materials, and walking with you through the application process. As you can see, those 4 bullet points correspond generally to the 4 sessions that we're doing for the boot camp this summer. We're situated, as I mentioned, in Cornell Career Services. This is the central office, so we administer a lot of the campus-wide resources as well as provide a full suite of career services advising to students and alumni. We have colleagues in the office who specialize in different areas from international student careers to public service careers to consulting and finance, as well as can provide general advising on things like career exploration, job and internship search support, interviewing, basically anything you might need relative to career. We have it in advising, as well as we have lots of platforms and resources that we manage on the website to which you have access, including particularly the Career Development Toolkit, which we're very proud of. It includes modules on most career development topics, ranging from exploring your interests to all the nuts and bolts of networking and applying for jobs. Current students and students within the last couple of years have access to this already. You're automatically enrolled. If you're an alum and you don't have access to this, you can go to the website and get access to it. It's available to alumni too. It's a really great resource. As I mentioned, I'm going to be sending these slides out after this session. So there's going to be QR codes and links running through the presentation. If you can't get them down or can't access them right away, you're going to get this evening, basically as soon as we wrap up. So don't feel like you have to get everything down on the first pass. I want to call out specifically a resource we have called the GAPS Fund. That is the Graduate and Professional School Fund that we administer. It provides financial support to students who are applying to graduate and professional programs to cover those expenses that aren't easily covered by other supports. So buying exam prep materials, registering for exams, and paying application fees, which mount considerably. If you attended the last session, you can see that the baseline budget for applying to law school is already quite expensive. Currently, this is only available to current students, so you need to be currently enrolled or returning in the fall to be eligible for this. Currently, alumni, unfortunately, are not eligible, but anybody who is a current student who intends to apply within the next 12 months and is in good standing is eligible to apply. If you think this would help you, we highly recommend applying for it. It is currently closed to everybody, but will reopen on August 11th for the next application cycle, and then will reopen through the coming academic year. So turning to our first topic, what are law schools looking for? We're going to discuss sort of our major targets, major things to keep in mind as we're putting our materials together. I just want to remind before we dive in here that if you have questions, we're going to be stopping periodically along the way. Dana will also be answering them in chat. So please go ahead and throw them in the Q&A as we go, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end where we can wrap up. Okay, so we take our guidance, our main kind of North Star in answering this question comes from the ABA. And the ABA says to people interested in law school that they don't recommend any particular major or courses for somebody who wants to be a lawyer. And instead actually encourages prospective applicants, prospective lawyers, to pursue an area of study that is interesting and challenging and that provides opportunities to develop research, writing, the skills that a lawyer would need to be successful. So that suggests more broadly quite a bit of flexibility and no real hard targets to be shooting for. On the one hand, this is empowering because people applying to law school can come from any background, any direction, and we do have people apply successfully from every college, every major at Cornell. But it's also a little daunting because there are no hard targets, and so it's hard to develop a list of things that you might be able to check off to make you a more competitive candidate. The broad idea here is that you have a lot of control, but also a lot of responsibility in shaping the narrative and telling the story and helping a law school understand your purpose and your fitness for law school. But to boil it down a little bit, I think we can talk about two broad categories of things that law schools are interested in. First, they're interested in applicants who have an outstanding record of achievement and involvement. What does that mean? They're looking for applicants who have that course of study that's rigorous, challenging, meaningful to the applicant, and that develops those essential skills. As I mentioned, you can come from any background. We have students from engineering, we have students from biology, from theater, from, of course, some of your more traditional majors like government and history and English and philosophy. I have applicants from the hotel school every year. I've just met with a couple this week who are interested in applying to law school, and everywhere in between. Wherever you're coming from, they really like and they privilege strong academic performance test scores. So GPA and LSAT, you may hear that kind of reduced to. Those are major factors in the application. Not the only factors. We'll talk about them in a little bit, but they are major factors. They like to see involvement in the classroom and particularly outside the classroom, professionally, in volunteer settings, campus involvement. Again, things that are meaningful to you, that are impactful, that can showcase leadership ability or develop leadership ability. Lawyers, wherever they're going to be situated, are tasked with a lot of responsibility. So having some capacity for leadership is really important. Just like your major, they don't have to be law related. Um, because they will be related to skills and things you can bring into the legal profession. You need to have some understanding of how that might relate, but they don't have to be law related. And quality here is so much more important than quantity. We'd much rather see you engage in one or two really meaningful things than pad out your resume with all kinds of things that you kind of checked into halfway, but can't really talk about with any substance. And then, of course, they like to see people who can also reflect that story and the rigor and the interest and everything back in the form of recommendations, primarily from professors, professional mentors. We'll talk about that in detail in just a little bit. So that's achievement and involvement. The second category of things are applicants who can convey a clear purpose, an interesting perspective, a clear direction, clear goals. Applicants who, to sort of lay it out, are passionate about something and who have applied or pursued those passions in interesting ways up to the point of applying, who would bring an interesting perspective of some kind to the law school class in the legal profession. And that's broadly construed. Interesting can mean a lot of things, but somebody who would be an interesting participant in the conversations that are ongoing, would bring skills, would bring a perspective, would contribute something, who can articulate a mature and compelling reason for pursuing a legal career, so who know why they're doing what they're doing and can articulate it, and who are ready to face the challenges of law school. Okay, so who are ready, applicants who are ready to engage in an intensive, challenging academic program, and that you can be tied to your previous academic achievement. Okay, people who have outstanding records of achievement and involvement, and a clear sense of purpose and direction, and interesting perspective. Right, slightly more specific targets to hit, not super specific. And we're not going to be able to get much more specific than that, because so much of what we do in the application depends on us individually. It's really helpful if you've attended the previous sessions, we've talked about this before, to think about your materials as telling a story, as telling stories, as introducing yourself to the committee, framing your materials and your experience in ways that relate to your application and make it make sense. They tell your story, they talk about how you've come to the law and why you want to be a lawyer, how those goals have taken shape and what plans you've made to meet them, where law school fits, how your perspective has developed and what you're going to contribute, how you've managed challenges and responsibility, and how you know you're ready for law school. There are stories behind all of these things, and you can marshal your experience, you can marshal your background, your expertise, your interests, your skills to tell these stories, to give them personal shape. That's a big part of what we think about when we think about creating strong materials, is hitting these points, highlighting these points, showcasing them through your own individual journey and background. So thinking about, as you put your materials together, what are the stories you want to tell? What elements of your background and experience and everything else do you want to make sure are in there? What do you want to make sure somebody sees? And what is it most important for you that an admissions committee understands about you through your materials, setting some of those goals as you go forward? You have lots of opportunities in the application to tell these stories, lots of qualitative, which is primarily what we're going to be talking about, your essays, your resume, what people write about you in the form of recommendations, your character and fitness records, which can suggest some things, but also be given context, interviews down the road. We won't be talking about interviews today because they're more sort of an in the middle of the process thing, which we'll be talking about at the next session. But everything else here we'll be talking about today. And there's also quantitative parts of that story, your transcripts, your exam scores, and you have an opportunity as well, even with these quantitative measures, to provide some qualitative context in the form of your other essays, but also something like an addendum, which again, we will talk about. So lots of opportunities throughout the application to tell a story, to tell stories, to explain to an admissions committee why you're doing what you're doing, why you're ready for it, why you need law school, why you know you're going to be successful. So we're going to dive into ways to do that successfully. Some guiding principles to keep in mind wherever you're looking at the application that can really steer you toward, I think, making the strongest applications. For the first part, consider everything that you do to be part of your application. And by that, I mean every document, every form you fill out, and particularly every interaction you have with law schools. This could be email, this could be on the phone, this could be at a law fair. They'll know, they'll record, they'll remember. And it's really important to engage with law schools productively and appropriately as part of this process. What does that mean? Often, just like with networking, when you're talking to a law school, particularly as you get closer to the process, what you really want underneath it all is like, I want a boost. I want somebody to help me. I want to talk to them and I want it to do something for me in my application. That's really hard to achieve intentionally. It's really hard to go out and have a conversation with somebody in an admissions office and know walking away from that conversation that like, this is going to boost my application. It's really easy to try to fish for that and be unproductive. You know, to have a conversation that goes in a way that you're not hoping for, or is obvious in a way that you don't want, that leaves a bad impression. So more important, I think, when you're engaging with a law school is to do so in a way that's productive for you. So that is go to a law school, talk to a law school, go to admissions events, tour the law school, talk to current students about things that will inform your application and inform your decision making. So about what the school offers, about the programs that they have, about their graduates, their employment numbers, their financial aid, all these different things that inform your decision making that don't directly relate to you asking an admissions officer, hey, can I have a boost? But by displaying some mature decision making can, leave that impression, but also might lead you into a conversation that has some kind of an impact. You can't plan for that kind of thing. These kinds of interactions don't necessarily have a positive impact on the application, except indirectly, as far as they inform what you write. But they can have a negative impact. You can leave a bad impression on a way that sticks. So you really want to be careful as you're talking with law schools about how you frame that. That said, law school admissions officers are normal people. They're accessible people. They're understanding people. They like when applicants are transparent with them. You can ask them questions. You can approach them. And if you attended the previous session, we talked about lots of different ways and questions to ask of law schools as you engage with them. Make every part of the application, so principle number 2, make every part of the application contribute in some way. Every piece has a role to play and should contribute something specific. And this is a great rule to have in mind as you're thinking about, like, should I write an optional essay? Should I add this in? Is this already addressed somewhere else? You want to have your application almost as lean as possible insofar as things don't repeat each other more than they need to. Every page is worth turning. Everything adds something new. So that means, 1, we want to avoid repetition, but 2, the burden of telling the story, the big story, isn't on any one piece, including the personal statement. So you have a lot of the materials can contribute and support each other and complement each other in some important ways. We're thinking big picture here and what role each piece plays in supporting that bigger story. Write about yourself honestly, genuinely, in your own voice, and capture what we talk about as the emotional narrative. So not just the facts of what you've done and what you're going to do, but why, how you responded to the things that you've done, how you've grown and developed over time, what you need, what you care about, what your goals are. This emotional narrative underpinning the things you write is really what sells an application. We're going to turn back to that when we come back to the essays later in the application, or later in the presentation. And finally, a really important mantra for me that I talk with students about all the time. If you've had an appointment with me, I'm sure I have mentioned this. If I haven't mentioned it yet, I will, which is don't apologize. What that means is, in the context of your application, don't lead with weakness. Don't lead with your perceived weaknesses. It's really easy, totally normal, very common to come into this process and feel like, I don't have the GPA that I need. I didn't take the right classes. I don't have as much experience as I would have liked. I'm an uncommon major, so maybe that people are going to wonder, like, why am I doing this? I've been out of school for a little while. They're going to want to know, like, why am I leaving my job? I'm going to have to explain all of this stuff. That feeling of needing to like explain before you can really get into your application is this need to apologize. Like, I feel a weakness and I need to get out in front of it. I have to tell them. It's a feeling of self-consciousness. It's a feeling of anxiety about really putting yourself out there in a big swing, which is applying to law school. And the goal is to not do that. The goal is to lead from a place of confidence, not like, how did you get here and how did you end up here, but why are you confident this is the right decision? And where does that confidence come from? What's interesting about your perspective and what are you going to contribute? Not what do you feel is lacking. In challenging situations, taking ownership, emphasizing growth, but not begging forgiveness, say, for something that went wrong. It's leading from strength, leading from a place of confidence that's really, really key. This is hard to do. It's very hard to do. People have a hard time selling themselves. People have a hard time taking credit. It's particularly hard to locate yourself in the context of other applicants, to like know where you stand. Is this good? Is this bad? Is this good enough? Am I competitive? I don't, and a big part of what advisors do is, Dana and I talk about this all the time, is be cheerleaders for our applicants, is be there and help you get some context, get some perspective, frame, competitive materials. This is not easy to do at the beginning, but as you go through and revising, we really want to pull that apology out, pull the strength to the front. That's a big part of what we do in our conversations with students and applicants about the materials. Right now, don't dwell on it too much. but just keep in the back of your mind, like, I don't need to apologize, right? If this feels like the right decision, I'm going to explain why it's right, not why somebody else might think it's the wrong decision, if that makes sense. Okay, we're going to pause here before we get into the materials themselves. Dana, any questions from the audience?
Yeah, there was one question in which may make sense to address a little bit later, but it was in regards to an addendum.
Oh, sure. Yeah, let's hold that for the addendum section,
Yep,
which will be part of
perfect.
this material section right at the end.
Great.
Okay. The first thing I want to talk about is the application form. This often gets overlooked as a part of the materials in favor of some of the flashier things. It's really crucial. And what I want to talk about in particular is how to find it. This may seem really basic, but I find over and over again that applicants are hesitant to actually access the application form. They're afraid of making a mistake. They're afraid of applying accidentally. And this is really crucial to get to this form as soon as possible, because this is where the actual questions are. This is where the targets you actually have to hit are. They can change from year to year. You'll find things on secondary websites all over the internet that might tell you what you need to do, what essays you need to write, what the requirements are. But this is the actual source. And once they open, you need to access them as soon as possible. So I'm going to walk through steps, how to get there, just in case you're unfamiliar with the process. And particularly, I'm going to show you the point in this process that I think daunts a lot of people and prevents them from actually seeing the form. So we're going to do that right now. You're going to create an account on LSAC. If you haven't done that already, this is free. You sign up for LSAC, LawHub, they're the same account. You'll access your dashboard, so your landing page within the JD account on LSAC. And the first thing you need to do to apply is to add schools to your list. So you'll search for schools and you'll build your school list. So you'll add LSAC member law schools, and this will give you a big long list of law schools in the system that you can choose from. So these are all the ABA accredited law schools. Schools that you already have on your list, you'll probably be coming back and forth this screen a number of times, show up with a gray checkbox. And then the new selection, when you're going to be adding to the list, you check and you click Save Selections, school list up at the top. This will return you to your dashboard. You'll click My School List. This will take you to the school list page. You'll scroll down. You'll find the school you're interested in. In this case, we're going to use Georgetown as an example. And you will click Start or Continue Application. This is where we start running into trouble. You click it, and it gives you this list of options of different applications, different application types you could choose. Georgetown's a good example here because they have a ton. Many schools have 2 or 3. You'll pick the one that best suits you. So the one that I've selected at the top is first year, non-binding with an LSAT. This is what we would consider the normal application. You're applying for 1L, that is the first year of law school as an incoming student. You're not applying early decision, so it's non-binding, and you're applying with an LSAT. There are lots of other options and permutations. For our purposes, that's the normal one. You can see this is from this current cycle that's ending, so these are the deadlines for last year, but they'll be updated once applications. You click it, you scroll down, it will show you the fees. So here we can see Georgetown charges an $85 application fee, LSAC charges a report fee, and then here's where people freeze. You click apply, and you get this error box, or you get this dialog box that says, once you do this, you can't make any changes to the type and the term. Are you sure you want to do this? I think the combination both of a warning box and the button that says apply, people sort of freeze here. Click OK. It's totally fine. You're not going to make any problems. You're not going to harm yourself. There's so many more steps you're going to need to take to actually apply. I have done this dozens of times in my time as a pre-law advisor for all different kinds of schools. Nobody has gotten mad at me. Nobody's emailed me about it. You're not, by doing this, not going to cause a problem, and actually may save yourself a lot of hassle, because you're going to get to the application form and actually see the application questions that you're going to need to do. So you go here, you'll click application, and that gets you this on the right-hand side is what the application form actually looks like, and you go through the various sections. You can see here on the left-hand side, there's step 1, you have to complete the whole form. Step 2, you look at it. Step 3, you have to pay your fees and continue and then apply. There's a lot of steps you have to go through before you apply, so you won't accidentally apply. And all the steps and things you might add in here before it's complete have no bearing on your application. The law school doesn't receive it until everything is compiled and it's sent out to them. Applications for the new cycle open September 1st, generally September and later. So right now, applications for the coming cycle, that's the 25-26 cycle, are not available. The questions that we have, the materials that we have, the form that we're looking at here is from last year, the current year that's wrapping up. So most of it's going to stay the same, but our political climate is such that things are likely to change. So we have a rough idea, probably a pretty good idea of what it's going to look like, but we won't know for sure doesn't tempt it. When you get it, read the instructions really carefully. There's a lot of information there. They vary between schools, what schools want, what they mean by certain things. The rules and expectations may be spread across multiple sections. This isn't uncommon in something like the personal statement, where the instructions might include information about the length that they want, but the personal statement section itself, you can see down there on the bottom right, will actually have the questions you need to answer. And you want to pay particular attention to rules about AI. This is a moving target. Things are developing. Schools are changing year to year. But you really want to pay careful attention about what is and isn't allowed for the schools you're interested in. And you want to know that early, because if a school forbids something that another school allows, you want to know that, because that may have implications for your materials as a whole. Optional, you can see on the right-hand side, we're going to encounter this word optional twice in this presentation. In this context, optional means optional sometimes, and it could also mean required in some cases, depending on what you choose. So optional could mean an optional essay, in which case you get to choose whether or not to write it, or it could be required in the case of like a character and fitness statement. If you answer that you have a character and fitness issue, you'll have to write an addendum that's required, but only in that case. There are lots of questions throughout in the demographic section above that are optional to answer. You won't be penalized for choosing not to report your gender, your race or ethnicity, or any other law schools you're applying to. That's a question we get a lot. You have the option, many schools will ask you to give a list of other schools you're applying to. You don't need to provide that. You can. They use it generally informationally to assess themselves relative to your schools. It doesn't bear on your application. If you're uncomfortable reporting that, you don't have to. All right, we're going to turn to character and fitness because it's an element of that form, and then we're going to work our way through the other parts of the application. But I want to pause here quickly and see, are there any questions to address?
Yes, we had two questions.
Sure.
The first one I'll read says schools have no way to find out whether or not you had extra time or accommodations on the LSAT unless you tell them, right?
This is correct.
That's
There was a lawsuit years ago. It used to be that the on the score report, so that they receive what's called the CAS report, which is the cover sheet to your application, which includes your academic information and your test scores. We'll talk about that in just a second. It used to be that accommodations were noted on that. That's no longer the case. They do not receive information one way or another. They also don't know if you took it in person or remote.
good question. Okay, and then the second question says, what if you decide to switch your application to ED after opening that tab that you showed
Yeah,
before?
let me go back to that. On the bottom left here, you can see where it says delete application. You just delete it. So I did this today so I could actually get these screenshots. You just delete application and then it scraps everything. So you'll lose it all. But then you just open another one. So if you say, hey, I do want to apply ED, then you'll just start a new application with the school. It doesn't hurt you at all. It just won't save that information probably. You'll have to enter.
We had one more come in too.
Yeah, sure.
It says regarding LSAT test dates, I feel like I probably will be taking the LSAT in November. So I was wondering if you can send in applications to schools before that final score gets sent in, or do you have to wait until all scores are in before applying? It's a good question. Get that all the time.
Yeah, let's tackle that one. If it's your first LSAT, if you have no other LSAT scores, so you're waiting, say you're taking the November test, you haven't taken the LSAT, all of your other application materials are complete, you can submit, but your application is incomplete. So the school could get the materials, but they won't act on it. It won't be indicated as complete until the test score comes in. If you have a test score and you're retaking in November, then your application is complete and you can submit. The question is what happens next. If you're hoping for that higher test score and you want a school to see it, schools can do one of three things. One, they'll automatically review it and they won't wait. Two, they'll automatically hold your application until that score comes in because they can see if you have a pending LSAT. Three, they'll hold it if you ask them to hold it. Every school is different on how they choose to do this. This is a tough choice to make because we're balancing the prospect of stronger application materials against applying early. The November test is kind of the tipping point for that because you're going to get your score in late November, early December, which is like right around that Thanksgiving deadline that we recommend. So it's really not late. So that's probably okay, but it is later than some ED deadlines. It is later than some priority deadlines. It's later than what we've been recommending as kind of a more aggressive deadline of like Halloween. So you may feel like you want to apply and then take another LSAT. The risk there is if you're waitlisted off that initial application, you can submit a higher LSAT. That's very common as a way of submitting a new score for, excuse me, for reconsideration. And it's not that big of an issue. It's not the best first impression, but the higher LSAT, will certainly prompt them to take another look at you. So not that big. The real risk is if you get rejected off that first review, they may not open your file again, even if you come in with a higher LSAT. It used to be, this has been an enlightening year for us. It used to be, I assumed a hard and fast rule. If you're rejected, it's closed, they won't reconsider. Well, turns out that may not be the case. You can always ask for reconsideration. We had files get reopened this year in a way that I haven't seen before. So who knows? But it's worth being very cautious because they may not reopen if you've been actually rejected. And so you're taking that risk. Some people choose, depending on what your first LSAT score is, to maybe apply to schools where that's a fine competitive score, and then maybe delay waiting for that other LSAT for maybe more reach schools where you're hoping for the higher score. Some people just apply and then they'll take the test and then submit it later. Some people wait. When we're in that like September, October, November, December timeframe, I think either option is probably okay. It's when we're looking at like the January and the February test. January gets you your scores February gets you your scores in March. All of those months are very late in the application cycle. And so at that point, I probably would privilege applying over waiting for the LSAT, but it comes down to the individual case and definitely something you can talk about. It's a great question.
We had one more come in, unless you want to tackle, this is about the LSAT, another question, so I
Yeah,
don't
let's do
know.
that. Yeah, we're on the
Okay.
LSAT.
Okay, says, is there a recommended amount of times to take the LSAT?
Yeah, not recommended. One, all things being equal, taking it once would be ideal. It's cheaper and it presents a much simpler image to the law school. But most people retake, I think. I don't have a good number on that. I'm trying to get that from LSAC, so I don't have a clear number on retake, but it's very, very common. And I think a majority of people do retake. Retakes are not a big deal. You know what? Let's hold that. Let's hold the retake question because I actually have a bullet point on that and a couple of slides, but we're going to come right back to that. It is a great question and kind of a complicated answer. Let's talk about, or is there any other questions at this
There was
point?
one more that just came in. I'm loving the questions, but I don't know if it would be better suited for a little bit later. It's talking about essay prompts, so maybe we can wait
Oh,
till
yeah,
later.
yeah. We've got a whole section on that. We'll get to
Okay.
that in a few minutes. Okay, so character and fitness is one section of questions you're going to get on the application form. And generally, there are two types of questions, three questions, but we can put academic and student conduct kind of together. They're going to ask you these very searching questions about your conduct history, your academic honesty history, and your legal history, that is, your engagement with the legal system. And you can see the way that these prompts are stated. These are pulled off, I think I pulled these out of Cornell Law School. I should have cited it. But similar prompts you'll see in every school. And it's not just, it's questions like, have you been warned? Have you been placed on probation? Have you been dropped, expelled? Have you been asked or advised or permitted to withdraw? Legal history. Have you been cited, ticketed, arrested, taken into custody, charged, indicted, convicted, tried for, or pled guilty to? So it's a very, very broad in terms of what they're interested in. What's really crucial here is that the questions are much more in the vein of, has something happened at all versus is there a record that you can show me that it happened? And so your obligation here is quite broad to disclose anything that might be relevant to these questions. And that includes things that are sealed or expunged. You'll sometimes see that explicitly stated in the questions. If you say yes, as I mentioned, you may need to submit an addendum to give some context. You may have to complete what's called a dean certification form in the case of things like conduct and academic honesty issues. This is a form that you would take to the school. We have instructions on the website for this. You take it to the school and the school it's essentially a request to the school to say, do you have records of this? Can you provide any additional information about this particular incident an applicant has disclosed? It's important to note here that the school's reporting obligation in this regard is much lower than yours. So our student conduct office doesn't disclose a lot of information. Once you've graduated, they disclose even less. Reportable offenses have to meet a very high threshold before they become reportable. The school, in most cases, will say there's nothing to report, even if you have something. You got cited for having a candle in the dorm, you got picked up for smoking pot, whatever it is, school's probably not going to have anything to say about that. It's sort of run-of-the-mill student conduct stuff. So there'd be a discrepancy between what the school says and what you say. This is normal. This happens a lot of the time. If you have to do a dean certification form, that's okay. Law schools understand the discrepancy and the different reporting obligations. What's important is that you need to disclose. And if unsure, you should err on the side of disclosure. Certainly should contact the law school. Make sure you understand what the questions are asking. It's important to note that these questions vary by school, they vary by state. And why this is so important and why it's worth dwelling on is that these don't matter as much to the law school as they matter to the bar. Of course, the law school cares. But a law school is under an obligation to only admit people who have a reasonable chance of passing the bar. And the bar asks character and fitness questions. And they're very serious about them. And one of the things they do when they ask those questions is they pull your law school application materials and they look at them and they compare your answer that you gave the bar to the answer you gave your law school. They may do their own investigating. If there's a discrepancy or they find something you didn't disclose, they will go to your law school and they will say, would you have admitted this person if you knew about this and knew that they covered it up? And if the law school says no, you're in real trouble with the bar because your degree, is not very useful at that point. It's much, much better to disclose. In many, many cases, things are not disqualifying. Things that are disqualifying are very serious felony offenses. Things having to do with professional standards, ethics, things like that, misrepresentation, fraud, embezzlement, academic honesty violations are taken pretty seriously. Not in and of themselves immediately disqualifying. Patterns of problematic behavior much more important than isolated incidents. And of course, you have an opportunity to explain yourself and provide content to show growth and all of that. So things aren't immediately disqualifying, but in all cases, the cover-up is worse than the offense. If you try to hide it and not disclose it, it can cause real problems. Assume the bar will find it. So better err on the side of disclosure. This is something you definitely can come to talk to us about and something you can talk to law schools directly about if you have questions. Okay, before we turn to the record, any questions here that we haven't put off?
We have, let's see, okay, there's one character and fitness question that just came in and we're gonna hold the other two. If you were pulled over for speeding, but were deemed not guilty and not ticketed, should you report that?
It depends on the questions, right? So if we go to the legal question, this one says, have you been cited or ticketed? If you weren't cited or ticketed, then probably not. You weren't charged, you weren't indicted, you weren't convicted, you didn't plead guilty, you didn't pay fine, then maybe not. And the same in like a student conduct case, if somebody told you go talk to the RD, but nothing was filed, nothing happened, somebody just sort of said like, don't stop doing that. That's also not something that really falls, but you've been warned in the case of the initial question up here. If you've ever been the subject of disciplinary proceedings or been warned, you kind of want to dig into like what they mean by warning. Do they mean formally warned, like issued a citation when you're warned, or just had a conversation? Probably something a little more formal than that, but there is some ambiguity here, and you'd want to make sure that maybe you ask the school what they mean by that. Schools also, some will exclude minor traffic violations, speeding, things like that. Some will not. Some will exclude minor traffic violations if they happened in the distant past. So it's really worth reading these questions very closely and erring on the side of the question.
Yeah, we got another one that's similar to this.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of the same response, but it said, are speeding tickets, for example, going 30 miles per hour in Cuba Heights in a 15-mile-per-hour school zone or something like that weren't reporting or disclosing? So
you'd have to go question by question.
Yeah.
Some exclude it, some include it. Yeah. Be very careful here and talk to us if you have questions. Okay, we're going to turn to the academic record. This is comprised of your transcripts, so you'll need to submit official transcripts from every college or university where you attempted academic credit. That includes courses you might have taken in high school, if you took courses and then transferred into Cornell, all of your transcripts. You'll have to include study abroad transcripts if you were in programs that were hosted by U.S. institutions. This is one of the most confusing rules in this entire process. What this means, if the credit was generated for your study abroad by a U.S. institution other than Cornell, if it was generated by Cornell, it's a Cornell class, then it doesn't matter. If you went on a study abroad program that was hosted by Harvard and you got a Harvard transcript with credit, that counts as domestic transfer credit and always has to be reported. Doesn't matter the length of time you were abroad. If you were directly enrolled in a foreign institution, an exchange program, or just direct foreign enrollment, anything like that, where you get a transcript from that institution that then is applied to your Cornell transcript, that doesn't have to be reported unless the total amount of time you were abroad across any number of trips, so if you did several trips abroad altogether, equals a year of study in the US or more. So many qualifiers here. But essentially, if you were abroad in bits and pieces for more than an academic year in the US, directly enrolled in a foreign institution, you need those transcripts. And they have to be submitted to LSAC. Everything gets sent directly to LSAC. You'll request transcripts from the institutions. They go to Cornell's registrar, you'll get your transcripts. They will send them to LSAC. They know how to do that. We have hundreds of applicants every year. They all get uploaded to LSAC's system, and you'll get 2 GPAs out of it. Sometimes they're the same, but if you have any transfer credit at all that's counted, they'll be different, probably. You have a degree GPA. This is the degree that Cornell gives you, or the GPA that Cornell gives you. So that's your degree GPA. You'll also get the UGPA. That's the undergraduate GPA. This is the GPA LSAC recalculates because they're going to take your courses and they're going to, from your transfer institutions, but don't count toward the GPA at Cornell. You get the credit, but not the grade. But they do count in the LSAC GPA. So if you had grades from another institution, they'll come in, they may affect your GPA up or down. It depends on your particular case. One thing to note here, a concern we get from a lot of Cornell applicants is like, I have an A+, or I've got, a GPA above 4.0, or I've just got a few A+ that count as 4.3 in the scale. I've heard that the LSAC GPA is on a 4-point scale. Am I going to lose credit? Am I going to get, reduced? The answer is no. A 4-point scale in this context just means that an A is 4 points. It doesn't mean that it caps at 4 points. So Cornell uses a 4-point scale. It just goes up to A+, which is 4.3. LSAC does the same thing. A pluses are counted as 4.3 in the event that the university awarding them counts them as 4. Okay. Test scores. So the other part of your major record, this is all compiled into the CAS report that LSAC compiles and sends, essentially the cover sheet of your application. You submit all test scores for the test you're providing within 5 years. So your LSAT scores are sent automatically. If you have GRE score, you have to send them separately if you want them considered. Check with school instructions. Some want them, some may give you the option to pick and choose. Many, I think, will probably request you send all of your GRE scores, just like you would do with the LSAT. So read that very carefully. Schools report the highest score for the test that's relevant to the ABA, and they give it the most weight. But, and this goes to the question about retakes and what's recommended, canceling a score or retaking the exam in and of itself, they're not particularly major issues. They're very common, particularly with something like Score Preview now. Cancellations are very common. Retakes are common, but anytime you have more than one data point, you begin to establish a trend. And so it's really worth considering what that trend might look like. Somebody who takes the LSAT 4 tests in a row and gets wildly divergent scores or all the same score or something, that can start to imply some things about their judgment, their preparation. It certainly could convey a certain sort of urgency, not necessarily a major issue, but it does tell a story. You may need an addendum or something. You just want to be cautious. You want to be intentional in your retakes. You want to make sure that every time you retake the test, you have a reasonable expectation of doing better that you can articulate, and not just, I'm just going to pull the lever on the slot machine again. I hope I'm going to do better. You want to be careful with that. Significant variation between test scores, let's say you improve 5 points or you do worse by 5 points, sometimes will automatically trigger an addendum for a school if they want one. If there's a story to tell behind the trends that maybe doesn't meet that threshold, it could still be worth telling in an addendum. I've mentioned addenda a lot already. I promise we're going to get to the slide that says addendum at the top. Any quick questions here before we dive into letters of recommendation?
Yeah, there was one about, can you purposely choose to submit your foreign institution transcript, even if it was one semester, if you want law schools to see this?
They're going to see the grades anyway, if they were submitted to Cornell. As to whether you can, so they'll be on your Cornell transcript, they just won't be figuring into the GPA. As to whether or not you could submit them anyway, you could. I would have to, you'd have to check with LSAC depending on the case, whether they would be counted. I don't know that they would, but that's not a question I've actually had directly. Dana, do you know that one?
Well, I was gonna say, I think you still can send them. But I would double check if there's like a fee associated with it or something like that, since it maybe wouldn't be needed, but.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. It's something, if you're something you're thinking about pursuing, I would reach out to LSAC and loop us in. It's not something, I'll say it's not common. It's not something I've had students really be interested in doing, but you know, if it's allowed.
Mhm. And then there was one more about a student role. I'm slightly concerned about high school credit. I've gotten both good and bad AP scores and didn't know they'd affect consideration for law school.
Then you should be glad to know that they don't. AP scores are not included in the calculation. Only like awarded college, graded college credit is awarded. AP scores don't count.
All right, and then we have one for letters of rec, but I think I'll save that for after.
Well, here we are. Okay, letters of recommendation. So a big part of your application is people writing about you, and letters of recommendation that you submit or that they submit to LSAC on your behalf. The general rule, the baseline recommendation is that you get 2 letters from faculty members, 2 academic recommendations. These can come from faculty, they can come from grad students. I generally don't recommend 2 from grad students, not mostly just because I think there can be some bias against grad students. 1 is totally fine. If they're 2 really good ones, I think you can't. It's just out of a caution on my part, because there are faculty reviewing these that they may wonder, like, why isn't there a faculty member writing here? 1, totally fine. If you can get 2 faculty, that's great. They speak to you're wanting people who can speak to your strengths as a student and forecast your ability to succeed in law school. And they're addressing those skills that you're going to need to be successful, and how you've demonstrated those, how you've exhibited those, how they've seen those through the work that you've done with them, of course, project pieces, stuff like that. You can also submit professional recommendations. So we often will recommend that students have 2 academic and 1 professional if they want. Professional recommendations are by no means required. If you've been out of school a long time, you may lean more heavily on these than the faculty recommendations. They address similar things from a different perspective, right? So they're interested in those same skills. They're interested in your ability to succeed, to handle responsibility through reference to professional work that you've done. Ideally, it would come from relevant work. It doesn't have to be law related, but relevant work, something that might have some bearing on the work you might do as an attorney. Some recommendations for the letters of recommendation. 1, you want people who know you well. This is the golden rule of recommendations. People who can write about you specifically and with substance. They should have had an opportunity to substantially observe you in an academic or a professional context. You want to seek strong recommendations, and in fact, you should probably ask for them explicitly. Are you comfortable providing me a strong recommendation? And give people the chance to decline. Give them the option, give them an out if they're not comfortable with it. Not everybody feels they have the basis from which to make a recommendation, and you want to know that up front. You don't want to go into this with a lukewarm recommendation when you could maybe be getting another one. You want to allow plenty of time in this process to reconnect with people, and then for the letter writing itself. A lot of people are anxious, I'd say particularly graduates, but anybody is anxious about contacting a professor that they haven't talked to in a year or 2, or it's been a while, and afraid, well, they're not going to remember me, or it's been so long. And this is normal. This is fine. This happens. When you ask somebody for a letter of recommendation, you don't freeze them in time. So they're not then required to write a letter from what they remember in the moment. Asking for a letter is the start of a conversation. It's really important that you reach out early. You say, hey, let's set a meeting. Let's talk about this. I was hoping to ask you for a letter of recommendation. And in that meeting, you can start the conversation about catching them up, reminding them of work you did, talking about your plans, talking about your application, setting a timeline for when the letter would be needed. And in that timeline, you want to allow at least a month for them to write the letter. So now, if you're thinking about applying for this cycle, now, end of July, August, this is a great time, if you haven't already, to start contacting recommenders. You want to, in that conversation, you can strategize with your recommenders about what to include, what to highlight, what stories you're telling, and what role they'd want to play. You can provide, and they may ask you for letters or for your resume, for your application essays. You want to be able to provide that and help orient them. You don't want to write the letters for them. So you can provide guidance, you can provide recommendations. They write the letter. If they're asking you to write a letter, to sign it, you need to decline and try to divert them back to the conversation. If they're not willing to do that, you probably should seek another recommender, as uncomfortable as that can be. And you don't want to seek recommendations from people who don't have a substantive basis from which to evaluate you. So law schools don't like the I'm a senator letter, like a boilerplate, I'm a senator. Like, they're not dazzled necessarily by titles. They don't love the family member who really loves you, but has only ever seen you in a, in sort of an informal context. They don't love the like, hey, I'm a graduate of this school and I barely know this person letter. Like none of these really fly. You're much better off finding somebody who's seen you, who knows you well, who can write about you with substance. I'm going to go through the next couple of sections. I'm going to get us up to the essays just to keep us remotely on time. For fair warning, we're probably going to go over 7 o'clock here in the Eastern time zone. Again, I will send you these materials if for some reason you need to drop off before that. The resume for law school is very conventional. It looks a lot like a resume you might use for a job with a couple of minor variations. Just like any normal resume, your name is at the top. You include your education at the top. As you go further in your career, the education will probably fall to the bottom, but this is a grad school application, so we'll put it at the top. And then underneath that is the body of the resume where you have a lot of latitude over exactly how you organize the experiences that you're including, with the general rule that things be organized with important stuff at the top in descending chronology within the sections. But you have a lot of latitude over what you call those sections that might allow you to highlight the information you want them to most see. So you can have a professional experience section, you could have a volunteering section, you could have a research, campus involvement, leadership. You can create different kinds of sections that allows you to divide up your experiences in such a way where you get to foreground the stuff that you really want them to see. Importantly, I don't talk about a section that you would see on a job application, which is a relevant experience. Law schools like to see everything within reason that you've done since high school. And so there really isn't relevant. What people mean by that in this context is they think they mean law related, but you don't have to have law related experience. Lots of things are relevant. So we generally avoid relevant experience, but we talk about other kinds of categories because everything is relevant. And because they like to see everything, they allow you, generally speaking, to submit a 2-page resume, where in most job applications, it's a 1-page resume. You're going to want to check school instructions. There are plenty of schools out there that will make you repeat all of this stuff in separate sections. So you'll find a school that has an activity and an employment section. You have to put everything from your resume in that and upload a resume. This is the one place where repetition in the application is fine. Like you're going to have to repeat stuff. That's okay. Unless the school gets a little specific about it. The one that comes to mind here is Yale. They have extensive activities sections, student activities, other activities, employment sections, and then they want a 1-page resume. So they do cut down the resume in favor of that. But most schools, 2-page resume, totally fine. In order, to create a strong resume, you want to create effective descriptions for each of the entries, each of the activities or jobs that you're putting in there. This is really crucial. These are descriptions that begin with a strong active verb. These are all recommendations you would use for any resume. So these aren't specific to law school. Strong active verb captures your individual involvement, even in a group setting. So even if you're part of a team, gives enough clear, specific detail that a reader can really picture you doing the thing. It's a good idea of what you did specifically, rather than fill that in with their own assumption of what it was. And quantify your work and show results where possible. So where there are numbers, certainly where there's impact that you can show, you want to do that. And you want to be succinct in your descriptions, as succinct as possible while still providing good information. Questions to consider here: what did I do? How did I do it? How often did I do it? And what kind of an impact did I make? Those would be really good guiding questions as you're thinking about putting these descriptions together. Some examples here just to run through quickly. Here on the left, you'll see some, I think, very simple bullets, pretty weak bullets, but a good place to start potentially if you're trying to put a resume together. And then some ways of transforming them into more substantive bullets. Things like planned several events can turn into organized 3 large-scale events for 250 members, including a networking dinner, a research showcase, and a professional development webinar. So it's a lot more detail, gives a sense of scale, responsibility. It's just, rather than somebody reading several events and then just kind of imagining like, oh yeah, okay, so that was a professional fraternity, so yeah, probably there's a fundraiser or whatever I'm imagining. Here we know specifically what it was that you did, and it's much more impressive. One thing to note here is these are longer. You can see substantially longer, and so you do have to be judicious with the space that they might take up, because not every position requires this much information or multiple bullet points like this, but where necessary, you do want to include good information that actually contributes to the application. Okay. Before we turn to the essays, any quick questions here? Looks like we've had bit of activity.
Yeah, I'm trying to answer them somewhat to get through them.
Okay.
But I think we're okay for now.
Good. Okay, great. All right, so we're going to turn to the essays, which is going to be the rest of our conversation for today. As an overview, the essays are the heart of the application. Your written statements, the written material that you provide in long form is the heart of the application. And it's your best opportunity to really tell these emotional and developmental stories that we've been talking about. A resume can imply them, but mostly a resume tells us what and when. What did you do? When did you do it? Essays tell us why. And this is really, really crucial. This is how we get to the heart of who you are. This is how we get to what it is you're really trying to convey to an admissions committee. Why did you do something? Why did it matter? Why are you making the choice? How did you react? How did you become the person you are today who's applying to law school? Essays carry the weight of this for the application. Of course, things like letters of recommendation address these kinds of questions too, because they can give that impressionistic perspective. But this is where you get to do it in your own voice. You establish the tone, the overall narrative of the application. You tell the committee, this is how I want you to see me. This is how I want to be understood. This is the kind of applicant that I am. This is what I did and why it mattered. So essays are really, really, really critical. That's why we've been spending some portion of every part of this boot camp talking about developing these materials, because they're where you have, in some ways, the most control over the application and how a committee sees you. There are two broad types of essays. This is sort of my own taxonomy of essays. The one that I think gets the most attention rightfully is what I consider narrative essays. These are essays you might be familiar with, like the college essay that you wrote, the Common App essay that you wrote when you applied to undergrad, that have you introduce a theme and kind of explore it through experiences and details and reflections in narrative fashion. The prompts for these are typically more open-ended. They require exploration of growth and development to answer. They are less direct sometimes until maybe the end. Examples of this include things like personal statements, optional essays. We're going to go through another couple of examples here, but questions like talk about challenges you overcame, or why public service matters to you, or what your qualities are and how you've exhibited them in your life and how they're going to relate to the law school. The personal statement is the central one, the archetype, the most important one of these narrative essays. It's the primary piece of writing in your application. It's usually the first thing that a reviewer is going to read after they read that cover sheet. It's your introduction, it sets the tone, and it should include the most important story or perspective that you want to offer in the application. But it doesn't carry the weight of the whole story. Often people, when they're trying to write the story of their personal statement, will kind of tell the story of their life, right? But the personal statement in every essay is a story. It's not the story. You're not writing your autobiography. You're pulling some important story or some important thread that you're demonstrating. The prompts are often very vague, very open-ended. They're sometimes not even questions at all. And so in answering them effectively, it can often require you to develop your own structure, your own targets that you're aiming at to answer the, to develop an effective essay. There are common ways of doing this, but there's no right way. There's no best topic. I've had great essays on very mundane topics and bad essays on very dramatic, exciting topics. The facts of the essay matter less than what you do with them and what they showcase about you. The emotional narrative that underlies the facts of that, how it affected you, how it influences your story. Conventionally, personal statements are 2 to 3 pages double spaced. Unless otherwise stated, read the instructions for the school. Personal statement is increasingly a general category. Some schools don't have what they call a personal statement anymore. Consider it a primary essay. Prompts and requirements vary, but it's still a useful category. You're thinking about the main essay that you're writing for the application. Here's an example of one of those unhelpful prompts, not the blast pen. The purpose of this personal statement is to provide you with as flexible an opportunity as possible to submit information you deem important to your candidacy, and to talk about how you're going to contribute to the community. Very vague, almost no direction at all, except that little contribution note there at the end, which is helpful. So one of the important things to do for a statement like this is to identify, like, what are some narrative ways in, what are some narrative questions you could respond to, some ways of thinking about this that will let you tell a story. So some potential questions are like, why are you applying to law school? Why now? And what experiences or influences got you here? Where do your goals come from? How have these experiences shaped your perspective, your values, the contribution you're going to make? These questions of why and how and where do things come from point to changes over time, point to development, point to stories, and give you a basis from which to tell a story. Personal statement doesn't have to talk about law. It's never a bad idea to land an essay in law, but it doesn't have to. but it should still in some way be concerning a topic that is of relevance to this decision, highlighting a quality or an experience that informs your perspective and that is relevant to the exercise of law school, practice of law. Some cautions for the personal statement and all essays, but particularly for the personal statement. Be careful of writing about somebody else. You should be in the foreground. You should be the main character. Even if it's a really important influence on you, you should be the main person. Be careful summarizing or restating the resume. You probably have heard this advice a lot. It gets overstated online to the point that many people feel like they can't talk about anything from their resume. That's not true. Remember we said that a resume does what and when, a personal statement does why. You can draw on your resume because that's the record of things that you've done. But the personal statement shouldn't just be a rehash. It shouldn't just be, I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this, and now I'm here. You want some kind of overriding theme or structure that gives us more direction than that. Here's how my investment in public service developed over time. Here's how I came to understand that law is the right decision for me and how each of these experiences pushed me in that way. Like that's the theme, that's the story. And you pull in relevant examples as necessary. You're not just giving us a chronological accounting of what happened. You want more than just time to structure why you're moving from one example. I would say just outright avoid unusual formats or styles. This is so high risk as to be almost just totally unadvised. Don't write a poem. Don't address a letter to the committee or a memo. Don't try to show off your legal writing by doing a memo or making a legal argument for your admission to law school. Just better not to do that. Stick to the convention here of writing an essay, a narrative essay of pages that are requesting. Be careful with quotations and dialogue. I wouldn't say that I would outright recommend against this, but be careful. I think more often than not, particularly in a short form essay like this, summarizing a conversation, summarizing a quote, rather than putting it in is more effective, it's more succinct, and it keeps the essay in your voice, keeps you in control, rather than ceding that to somebody else. Sometimes people will put in really important quotations, mantras, aphorisms, things that matter to them. That's a little different, but even then, I think you still want to be careful. Humor, these essays can be funny. You can use humor sometimes really effectively, but you can also use it really ineffectively. So if you want to use humor, you can use humor to convey a difficult situation. You just may have kind of a humorous outlook on things. You may be talking about a topic that's not ultra serious, but it still showcases something important. What you want to do is avoid sounding glib, unserious, or unprofessional about your direction. You want to be taken seriously. You can be funny, but don't be unserious. I mean, and that sounds oxymoronic, I know, but they mean two different things. You can have humor, but underneath it, the foundation here should be a serious purpose and a serious goal. You can address traumatic, negative, challenging topics. These are increasingly common in the law school application space, but do so carefully, do so intentionally. Admissions officers are telling us more often that they are getting trauma fatigue. They read a lot of these kinds of essays, but traumatic negative experiences often really underlie the perspective that somebody has on the world, their motivations for going to law school. They're really important parts of the story. So using these can be important, but you want to avoid a couple of things. You want to avoid what I call active processing on the page. You want to avoid sort of working through the feelings for the first time on the page, clearly kind of sorting through things in a way that you might in therapy session, which is important, processing a negative experience. You want to show some distance, some control, some reflection, some sense of where this fits in the larger story of your life. That doesn't mean you have to diminish it. Doesn't mean you have to make light of it, but you need to have your arms around it in a certain way, if only to suggest to a law school that this bad thing, despite it happening, you feel like you're ready to go to law school. The other thing you want to avoid is keeping it negative the whole time. If it's sort of digs into the trauma all the way through right to the end, it can be really draining for the reader, and it may not end on the note that you want it to in terms of getting somebody excited about your application. What I usually recommend for students writing about something like this, and I've had lots of topics, Dana and I, we both have seen a lot of these of people writing about sexual assault, about the whole immigration experience, about chronic debilitating illness, deaths in the family, poverty, all different kinds of things that really affect people's lives. And what I recommend in writing a story about that is take about the first half of the essay to really dig us in on the effects and maybe the negative aspect of this, and then start to pull the plane up a little bit, dig us out of the hole. And by that, I mean, again, not making light of something really negative or difficult, but starting to look forward and say, what does this mean? Where am I going? And if it motivates me, how does it motivate me? What does it mean to me? Start to pull us in that direction toward what you're doing next, why this matters. If you keep us in the sort of the really negative energy the whole way through, again, it just doesn't it can feel again like some of that active processing, and it can wear the reader out. This is difficult terrain to navigate. It's a primary thing that us as advisors could help you work, certainly. Supplemental materials, these are other essays, right? Other narrative essays. Optional in this case, this is the second time we're encountering that term, does mean optional with a couple of caveats. If an optional prompt would give you the opportunity to add something really meaningful to your application, especially for high priority school, I would recommend it. Essays can touch on similar topics from multiple perspectives, but they shouldn't, as we talked about, repeat each other. If given the opportunity to write a why X essay, that means why do you want to come to this law school? I would say probably do it if you have something to say. Sometimes you don't, and that's okay. But particularly if it's a high priority school, I would take advantage of this. Unhelpfully, some schools really like these, but won't ask you for them directly. So make sure for schools you're really interested in to attend admissions events, ask them if nobody else does what they think about a YX essay, figure out what they want. If they do want it sent separately or they want it included as an additional attachment for the application, but they don't tell you that anywhere, it's worth knowing that. Some additional essays are required. That's why I'm using the word supplemental in addition to optional here for certain reasons. Some, if you're applying to special programs like special fellowship programs or anything like that, they may have an additional statement you have to write. See, for example, NYU's application, which has a lot of prompts, depending on what you're applying to. Some schools have, many schools have additional prompts, shorter prompts as part of the application form that are required that we would call supplemental. Maybe the most famous is the Yale 250, but sometimes these take the place of the personal statement. Like Harvard doesn't have a quote unquote personal statement anymore. They have two essays, the purpose and the perspective essays, and that would kind of fall into this category. Conventionally, all of these are one page, unless otherwise stated. And like I mentioned, the tones can vary widely. Humor plays a role in some of these, but you can echo the tone, you can meet the tone of the prompt, but keep it professional. Here's some examples. So the top one from Vanderbilt captures what we would have traditionally called the diversity statement. Now it's a lived experience statement or a perspective statement or something like that. But really what this gets at is what contribution are you going to make to our school based in your background and your experience? Very broadly stated. But that's the still quote unquote the diversity statement. And then here's some other ones. There's the Yale 250 there. That's number 3, very broad, write about something that's important to you. Berkeley, you can see the more casual tone in Berkeley. What's the last thing you tried? How'd it go? Very conversational. Georgetown lets people submit a video. That's the whole prompt. Prepare a 1-minute video that says something about you. The rest of the prompt is how to upload it. So not many people do it. It can be daunting. Some people do it. Georgetown wishes more people would do it. But it could be an interesting way to go. But so some of these are multi-format. Some of them are lists. Give us a top 10. Give us your favorite song. Give us the last thing you read that was really interesting. So quite a range in the supplemental essays. The other category of essays, so we talked about narrative essays, that all broadly that we talked about fits into narrative essays. The other part of essays is what I would call declarative essays. So these are essays that are much more straightforward. You're asked a question, you answer it specifically, straightforwardly. Prompts are typically more pointed, specific, or just information. So some examples like, why do you want to come to this law school? That can be very bluntly answered. Informational sections, where do you want to practice? And they may give you like 100 characters. Okay, you don't have a lot of space for a story. An addendum, this is very straightforward. We're going to talk about that specifically here because these are really important. If it gets confusing, I'm going to flip back and forth between addendum and addenda. If you're not familiar with Latin, which is totally fair, addendum is singular, addenda is plural. I'll probably keep flipping back and forth. An addendum is a short factual statement that provides context or explanation for some part of the application. These typically come in 2 flavors. There's a character and fitness addendum. So if you wrote, if you said yes to one of the character and fitness questions, you're going to have to submit a statement explaining, providing facts. If there's some part of your academic record that you want to give context to, so say you had a difficult semester, you transferred, your GPA has a trend in it, you changed your major, that you want to give context that you feel isn't adequately captured by just the number of your GPA, this is a great opportunity to submit an addendum. Some caveats or conventions here. These are straightforward, almost reference documents. They are just provide the necessary detail and move on. They're not a place to litigate a dispute, certainly not a place to beg forgiveness. The admissions committee is not in a position to forgive you for anything. They just want to know what happened. So you take ownership, you clearly state what happened, you give any necessary detail, no more than that. You highlight growth if it was a challenging situation. What did you learn from it? How did you grow? How does it affect what you've done since? And you get out. 1 to 2 paragraphs, generally max, usually no more than a page at most. Obviously, that varies depending on the case or how many things you're talking about. Short and sweet, as short as it needs to be to get the job done. Again, this is something, this can be difficult to write, particularly because they often invoke some strong feelings. So something we can certainly work with you on. Before we turn to our last topic, which is drafting, Dana, any questions here to talk through?
I think I will save this last question, for the end.
Perfect. Okay, great.
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to continue this conversation we've been having about writing essays, about the essay writing process. In the first session, we talked about brainstorming, which is just collecting your raw materials as in as loose a pile as you can get, just getting something on the page without really any concern at all for like how it's going to apply or how you're going to use it, just getting your brain moving and getting stuff on the page you can work with. Then we talked about outlining. So that's developing a tentative structure based on those materials with an eye to certain prompts. Start establishing structure, start establishing goals, work toward the theme, the arc that you're going to be using in your essay to roughly run through the outlining process. You chose a prompt, you figure out what it is you're going to write to, you set your goals, you start collecting your materials, you decide how you're going to structure, you pick a starting point, you pick an ending point, you figure out kind of what the steps are in between, you fill it in with detail, you think about that emotional narrative, like how am I going to talk about what this means and why it matters, how am I going to transition between the different sections, and then you step back and you look at it. What's the arc? What do I need to change? Does this make sense? What's my main idea? What am I working toward? What feels out of place? What needs more detail? And then step 6, you write it. So then you try to write your essay. You write your first draft. We're talking here about an initial draft specifically. So this, just like the previous 2 steps, brainstorming and outlining, is exploratory. As you write, you think. You're working through ideas. You're working through problems. Things that come out as you write are probably going to be unexpected, probably not things you knew necessarily going in. And that's part of the point. You want to think about that big picture and you want to let yourself write. You're working just like on the outline, on structure, on purpose, not on refinement. And you want to give yourself the space to work through it. So finish the thought. If you think, remember 2 principles from this presentation, it's don't apologize and finish the thought. A lot of times we can get in our own way about particularly length in this process. You're worried about, I know this is going to have to be a 2 or 3 page essay. I'm drafting. I'm at 3 pages already. I've written way too much. I'm going to have to start cutting. Don't let yourself do that. Finish the thought. Get to the end. If you're on a topic that you know is going to be important and you feel like you're writing too much on it, write until you get to the end of that thought. Give yourself the space. We can cut. We can strip down. We can revise. That's all next week. We're going to get there. For especially the initial draft, let yourself finish the thought. Don't worry about necessarily how it sounds or its length. This is a long process and you're going to get there. To that end, consider using things like placeholders and scaffolding if you find yourself you've run into a part that you don't know how to get over. There's lots of other strategies like this. These are just 2 that I find particularly impactful. Placeholder is like you get to 1 paragraph and you need to get somewhere else and you don't know how to transition. You just write transition and then you just leave a space for it and just keep moving. Scaffolding, this is a really great way to trick yourself into writing something that you're having a hard time expressing, is by actually dialoguing with yourself in writing or out loud. So what I really want to say here is, and then make yourself finish the sentence. The main idea for this example is this, and finish it. This is a trick I will use on you in our meetings. I do it all the time. I very often have students who will come to me and say, I just really don't know what I want to say with this essay. And I'll say, well, what do you think you want to say with the essay? And then the essay will come out. It works most of the time. It's a really wonderful trick to try to just get yourself over that initial hump of saying the idea by making it casual, by taking some of the stakes away. Okay, when I start a sentence like this, I know the sentence is going to go into the essay. but it's not about the sentence. It's about the idea that you can then refine. Step 7, do it again. Keep drafting. So reflect on your draft, take a break, put it away, step away from it. When you have time, come back, write another. Don't get too attached to the early draft. We're working at big stuff, big picture stuff, which means things are going to move. Just think you need to be comfortable with things moving around, trying something and saying, I don't think that works. I'm going to try something else before you really get committed. If you commit yourself too early, this is just like that length problem. You're just going to close yourself into a box before you're ready. And keep what you write. So as you make those changes, keep a document, keep your drafts. When you do a new draft, open a new document, write a new draft, pull in stuff from the old one, but keep all of these bits and pieces because this is still brainstorming. This is still collecting materials. This is still shopping around for sentences and ways of expressing things. And maybe you write a paragraph that you really like, but then you take it out. Oh, this actually would have been great for an optional essay. So back to it. Keep what you write, even if you end up with 20 drafts, which I promise you have seen. Going through this iterative process will really, really help your writing in the long run. So to that end, this is the last piece here. I've put together a worksheet on drafting that maybe you might find helpful. It mostly restates here at the top. It's a lot of text, but I wanted to make sure you had it clear what we've just talked about. So it talks about drafting and it talks about kind of the headspace and your goals for this initial draft. And then it gives you a method at the bottom to try. So in this case, the Pomodoro method, maybe you're familiar with it. Basically what it means is breaking up your work session in a way that makes it more manageable and keeps your energy up. So after you've taken some time to kind of set your goals and get yourself situated, you write for 25 minutes, you take a 5-minute break, you do that 4 times, and then you take a long break. Just kind of keep yourself moving. I think what's really crucial here, in addition to taking the breaks, is when you take the breaks and while you're writing, try to keep the distractions down. If you're going to take a break, get up, move around, stretch, but don't get right on the phone. Don't immediately seek distraction somewhere else. Just kind of try to keep yourself in the space. Step outside, get a drink, grab something to eat, but don't set your brain off somewhere else. Keep yourself in that space because a lot of what's going on is kind of subconscious processing that's going to help your writing as long as you let your brain do it. So you keep doing that through these different cycles until you finish the writing, until you get to the end of the time for today. When the draft is done, put it away. Close the document, leave it. Don't look at it until at least tomorrow. Sleep on it, do something else. Getting some distance from it is really going to help you see it fresh when you come back to it when you go to do the next draft. That's why it's really, really important you allow yourself time for this. That's why we're talking about it now in July. You really want to allow yourself time to work at this over time, make iterations on the drafts, because your writing will improve if you work at this steadily over a long period rather than try to brute force it in a week or two. Okay, I'm going to bring my slides back up and we're going to wrap up here. We'll turn to the Q&A. So we hope you found this helpful, this series helpful. It's the first time we've run it. If you have feedback, we'd love to have it. One of the first pieces of feedback that I know we have is that these have run long. My interest is in giving you as much information as I have, which means that we probably will plan for an hour and a half next year. But any feedback you have, we would love to have it. We're going to run this every year as long as we're able to. And we would love, for you to use this as a basis from which to connect with us as you go forward through this journey. So there's my contact info again. I'm going to invite Dana back up and we will do Q&A until we're done. So, but thank you in advance for everybody for attending. I will send you, like I said, the slides and that worksheet handout within the hour. Okay, what questions do we have?
Yeah, I saved one for this part because I thought it was a pretty good question for everybody. It says, how would we know when a score preview score is worth canceling? Is there a strategy or tips? And I would probably also incorporate like a cancellation in general, not just with the score preview.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
That's a great question. And Dana, I'm interested in your thoughts on this too. I've got my take on this is that I think we as advisors are more conservative with cancellations than applicants are. What I mean is, you have a score you have in mind. And so I'm going to use an example. Say you wanted a 170 and you pulled a 164. and it's off the mark of what you wanted, and your initial thought is, okay, I'm going to cancel. And my advice is probably don't. If the score itself is usable in some way to you, I probably would recommend keeping it because it provides a base, it provides a foundation to work from. It gives you a backstop in case that maybe a retake doesn't go any better. You've got that score. It's still something workable. And a 164 is a score that can be used. Now, it changes the window on your application strategy a little bit, but it's still a usable score. If it's way off and a score that you would never use at all, then cancellation, and probably it's going to fall in a gray area somewhere in between, in which case, definitely talk it out with us. But I would resist the impulse if you didn't get the score you were shooting for to immediately cancel, because I think you may end up, and we see this all the time, people throwing out scores that they wish they hadn't thrown out down the road. Some people like the stress of starting from scratch on the next test, but I think most people like having some kind of backstop. On cancellation without score preview, I think that's harder, because you got to go off vibes. You got to go off how you felt in the test. Again, I probably would lean toward keeping it unless there was like a serious extenuating circumstance. It was terrible, something interrupted, whatever, you sick. Um, because again, multiple scores and cancel, like they're not that big of a deal. It becomes more imperative, I think, if you have lots of scores, and we're talking about like canceling or keeping your third test or your fourth test. But um, I think, yeah, generally, I don't know, Dane, if you have anything to add there. I think we're
No,
generally more conservative.
Yeah, me too. I would say definitely more conservative if it's your first test, because I've seen students fall into the trap of canceling their first score, which Alex was alluding to maybe wasn't that awful, and then they've gone down, and so they're really in a rut. So I would definitely stress that. And I think it also is super dependent on your goals, right? Like everybody has different goals with their schools and what those medians are. So being educated on that too, but that's definitely something that Alex and I have conversations with students about. So if you're ever unsure, we are happy to talk through that based on your individual needs.
Yep. Yep. Other questions?
Yeah, there's another one here. What's the timeline for getting drafts done since apps don't officially open until September 1st? Should we have a bunch of drafts already prepared based on last cycle's questions before September 1? So we can spend the fall editing and tailoring them to this year's prompts.
I think, yeah, I would say, yeah. I don't know that you need a lot of drafts,
Right.
but I think as a general principle, using the summer to get yourself started, to do a lot of this big picture work, but allowing yourself the space to finalize during the application cycle. I think that's really key. Many people will come out of this, with a full draft, with full drafts of essays that they know they're probably going to have to write, or at least a full master draft of like, I know I'm going to tell this story. I know this, my personal statement is going to look something like this, and a draft like that. I think that's fine. Just don't, and I don't think it's a bad thing to shoot for. That's kind of why we've structured the boot camp in that way. But let yourself expect to make refinements and maybe even dramatic changes during the application cycle. We don't know what the questions are going to be. We don't know how they might change. So just don't have the expectation you're going to apply on September 1st. There's no benefit to that. And you may end up actually in the rush impacting your materials negatively.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Feel free to put them in the chat.
Lots of good questions this time.
Mm-hmm.
Do let it hang here for maybe another minute if you have any questions. That QR code takes you out to the main page for all of our pre-law advisors. We are here. We are at your disposal. We would love to work with you. This presentation, if nothing else, should serve as an invitation to come. Glad to help you. Right. Many thanks to everybody who has stuck with us here to the bitter end. Good to have you, and hopefully we will see you around. Best of luck with everything, and have a good night. Enjoy the weekend. Here. Thanks, Dana.
Yep.